So, Daniel, what has happened since last time?
It's been a long time since we've sat here, Linnea. It's also been way too long. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. And actually, it's because a whole lot of exciting things are happening. There's a lot of excitement happening in the watch market here in Denmark. There's a lot happening internationally. And there's also really, really a lot going on that's not directly about the market, but more about the manufacturers and their models and so on. To start somewhere, Watches and Wonders 2025 has just wrapped up. The world's largest watch fair in Geneva. We'll get into the big Rolex news, the Land Dweller, a bit later, among many other quite revolutionary announcements that were launched during the fair. I'd really like us to actually start by focusing on something other than just the watches at Watches and Wonders. What I've really noticed a lot in recent years is how the perception of the grey market has changed dramatically, not just globally, but certainly here at home as well. I remember that 10 or 11 years ago, I was really shocked by how people reacted to what was already being called the grey market back then. How it was considered the less respectable part of the industry. And as the name grey market suggests, well, it wasn't white, it was grey. So what did that mean? And it was seen as a bit of a taboo way to parallel import and do business. I couldn't really understand it because I thought it was us in this so-called grey market, which I actually much prefer to call the secondary market. It was actually us who were trading completely legitimately because we were subject to the free market forces. It was us who were the free merchants, and it was us who chose to set the prices based on supply and demand. So for a long time, I had a really hard time understanding why this was considered such a bad thing. The reason I mention this is that if we look at Watches and Wonders this year and in previous years, well, we can now make it absolutely clear that the grey market is just as much a white market as the primary market. And what I mainly base this on is the way the big social media profiles out there are handled. That is, those who have millions or at least several 100,000 YouTube followers. If you look at a Roman Schaaf from Luxury Bazaar, we've had quite a bit to do with him lately. If we look at Nico, who also has over 1 million followers on YouTube, as far as I know, well, then all of a sudden, they're the kings of a Watches and Wonders 2025 fair. Whereas if I take us back to, say, 5 to 7 years ago, we could barely even get in with a regular day ticket. And that's, of course, because both the brands, the manufacturers, but actually also the middlemen, the authorized dealers, have started to see the effect of it, and that they can't deliver organically interesting content in the same way that the potential customer sits and watches at home in the evening in front of their computer or TV screen, at the same level as you can when you're completely free and unrestrained in the market, like, for example, Roman Schaaf from Luxury Bazaar does. Now, these are also some very, very, very talented profiles we're mentioning here, and we should be careful not to lump everyone together. We are definitely nowhere near their level of skill when it comes to social media. But I think it's incredibly exciting to see the positive shift in how people have actually come to accept this grey market as maybe in reality just being a part of the market. And I think that's something many of us have fought for a very, very long time. We have on our own small, humble home turf in Denmark, just as they have in the US. Roman has been trading watches actually just as long and maybe even longer than I have. And it's really only now that we're starting to see the fruits of that we actually have a different level of acceptance around this market. If we look at examples of how Roman Schaaf he uses this platform they've created, well, then we see that there is direct correspondence with the manufacturers. It could also be Revolution, which is also super strong in Asia, but is also becoming quite well exposed in the Western world as well. They have access to the manufacturers. They can sit down with Richard Miller himself. They can sit down with the CEO of Patek. They can sit down with the top management of Vacheron and so on. And they are both listened to and spoken to, and it's really them who get the airtime. And I think it's absolutely fantastic to see how it takes the best of both worlds. This very old conservative authorized dealer world, which the manufacturers have primarily been a part of, and then over to this secondary market, which today is much more of a secondary market than a grey market, if you ask me.
Are there any other places, Daniel, where you see a maturation of this secondary market?
That's actually a really good question. I do think there are several places, and where it can especially be felt is not just a maturation of the secondary market as a whole, but also a maturation of us at the watch dealer and at UrHandleren Invest. Specifically, if you go back 7 or 8 years, every customer who started a dialogue with us would begin by asking, am I actually buying a genuine watch? And can we really trust that you'll deliver as promised? And do I dare transfer money to you before I receive my goods? And that maturity, that trust, which has developed both in the market as a whole, internationally as well as nationally, and certainly also the maturity surrounding us and our company, has simply meant that it's not even an issue today. There are very, very, very few people who start the conversation by asking whether the watch we're selling them is genuine, and much more often it's a professionally relevant inquiry where they need some sparring and advice from our sales team. And I think that's an extremely important point, and again, a very, very positive shift towards a more mature secondary market.
So, speaking of the market, how does it actually look overall?
The market is in a really interesting place, and we sat here at this table and talked about 6 months ago that we could see light at the end of the tunnel. And now we're actually standing out in the sunshine, and we're almost dazzled in the sense that in Q1 this year, we've turned over amounts that actually put us on track to set a new sales record this year, even compared to the very, very hot COVID years when things were really booming. So the market is in a really, really good place. There is a lot of confidence back in the market, and there are a great many good reasons, motivations to trade watches at the moment. On the investment side, which we'll get much more into later on, there we see a lot of people who want to get out of a super, super, super volatile stock market and into something that is much safer, more secure, and has a relatively high return over time, namely investment hours. Alongside that, Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, who are, in quotation marks, just looking for an Omega for 25,000 kroner, well, they dare to trade again. And people dare to put their money into something that is perceived as capital preservation and not consumption, namely watches. Whereas I think things are significantly tougher in other areas of the luxury goods segment at the moment. But the fact that people don't see watches as consumption but as capital preservation simply means that there is an opportunity to sell quite a few right now. Another good reason why things are really, really busy is, of course, that watches haven't been cheaper than they have been in the past few months for several years. We're actually back to the levels before the dramatic increases in value that happened in 17, 18, 19. We're actually back to what things cost right around before COVID, before things really exploded, before crypto went crazy, and before Ukraine was invaded, and all sorts of other things that have influenced this market for better or worse. So we're actually back again to where watches are being traded at a reasonable price. We can sell a Hulk for between 125 and 140,000 kroner now. There was a time when a Hulk had to cost 240,000 kroner in new condition, which is completely absurd. So we're back in a good place where everyone who bought a Hulk in 2016 for 57,000 has still doubled their investment. But on the other hand, it's much more accessible the moment it can be traded again for, let's say, 135,000, for example. So there is a market you can actually buy into, and there is a market that, most importantly, has stabilized tremendously over the last 2 quarters. Things now cost either the same or just a tiny bit more almost across the board compared to the end of Q4 2024. So there's a sense of security in knowing that you're not immediately taking a 30% loss when you walk out of the store, and that you're in a market where trading is possible and perhaps there might even be a gain over time. That just makes a lot of sense and gives a real incentive to trade right now.
We can't ignore the fact that a lot is happening in the world right now, and everything that's going on with the stock market and so on. What effect does that have on us and on the watches?
Well, the winds are constantly changing, just like Donald Trump's mood, and of course that has an impact. But where watches really stand strong is that they simply don't show the same volatility as so many other things. Usually you tend to see the effect that when people lose some money in the stock market, they tend to stick around because they want to make up for their losses. A bit like a bad night at the casino. It's really hard to walk out the door in that situation. But I think that this time we're seeing a different effect. Namely, that people have a certain realization that, okay, the stock market might not become stable again anytime soon. So maybe it actually makes sense to pull out now and move into some healthy, affordable collectibles. And that could be watches, for example. This effect at least means that many people are currently approaching watch dealers with a curiosity that is perhaps more motivated by the stock market than ever before. So people are ready to accept their losses, if they are losses, but at least their recent losses, and then leave the stock market. That is at least a trend and a tendency we are experiencing. What we can offer people here, in addition to a lot of investment strategy, is obviously these gold watches, which we especially also work with from an investment perspective. Well, at the moment, for example, most Rolex gold watches are trading far below their list prices, while gold itself is more or less at an all-time high. So there is a huge gap and a huge mismatch between the price of gold and how gold is behaving in the market. And then there are these cheap gold watches we have after the correction we experienced in the market the year before last. Of course, it's super, super interesting to look into because they're cheap. No one expects them to drop further, while at the same time, there's quite a significant investment potential in them in the coming period. So gold watches have suddenly gone from being something that many investment portfolios tended to shy away from to now, if you step in, you definitely want to ask for some cheap gold watches in an expensive gold market. A good example with the gold watches, Linnea. We recently sold a Rolex Submariner in full gold 12-6-18 LB, the newest version with the most popular blue dial, as a complete set in perfect condition for around 260,000. That's a watch that currently has a list price of about 340,000, and then all of a sudden we're talking about 30% below list price for gold that's being traded. It's priced far above list price, far above what the market has previously shown that gold can fetch. So again, that gap. It's just super, super interesting that you have the opportunity to buy Rolex watches cheaper from us than from the authorized dealer. Considering that gold is as expensive as it is, we of course also have to be careful not to mix apples and oranges too much, because the watch we're talking about here was pre-owned, but even in new condition we currently have the opportunity to sell these gold watches far, far below the list price. We made an offer on a gold sub, I think as recently as last week, where the price was under 300,000 kroner, and as I said, it's a watch that trades at 340,000, and that's for a brand new 2025 model. So again, there's a huge gap there and a really, really interesting entry into the market. And Linnea, I also think it's important to remember in the market we're in from an investment perspective. If you look at the C25 SRP 500 over the past 3 months, well, we've been down between 10 and 20% and are still quite far down. If you look at Rolex over the same 90 days, we're actually in the green, so we're in positive territory. I think that's an extremely important thing to consider as an investor, but also to keep in mind when acting in the market as a regular end customer at the watch dealer or with our competitors, that for the first time in several years, we are actually in a market where we are once again outperforming stocks, just as we did a few years ago. I also think that's an incredibly healthy sign for watches, and of course not quite as fortunate for the rest of the world, but definitely a good reason to start thinking in that direction.
Daniel, have we gotten anything new and exciting in stock that we're going to make some noise about this Easter?
We always have something new and exciting in stock, Linnea. But yes, a lot has actually happened there. We've chosen to listen a bit to the market, and especially at the very high end, something has really happened. Over the past 10, 15 years, we've had an enormous number of customers who started out entering this market and enjoying their steel Submariner from Rolex, then moved on to two-tone gold and steel, then to full gold, then to platinum, then maybe platinum with baguette diamonds, or they wanted to try something from Audemars Piguet, or maybe even a Nautilus from Patek and so on. Ultra, ultra high end. And at some point, it becomes difficult to keep outdoing your last investment or to do something wilder, bigger, or louder than before. But it's still possible in the sense that more and more people here in Denmark are looking at Richard Mille. And as far as I know, we are the only ones in Denmark who have dared to make a dedicated Richard Mille purchase. That is to actually stock Richard Mille in various models. What kind of manufacturer Richard Mille is and how it all fits together, I think we should make a completely dedicated video about that. In short, Richard Mille is a brand that is only about 20-something years old, and in 2024 they produced 5,700 watches, and they make about the same number of women's and men's watches, which means that there were actually fewer than 3,000 newly produced watches for men on the market last year. And of course, if your production is that limited, well, then there are other effects in the market that come into play. There are different trends, there are different economic influences that occur compared to if you are mass produced. That's not to say that Rolex necessarily mass produces, but there's a huge difference between producing about 1.2 million watches a year and producing 5,000 or 6,000 watches a year. So we've chosen to step quite firmly into Richard Mille, and we've sold quite a few. We've sold reference RM010. We've sold several of those, both in white gold and titanium. We've sold OR29 as well. At the moment, we're working on selling 1102, 1103, 6702, and whatever else they're called. And for most people, that's just gibberish. But we're really looking forward to showing you much more about that. Both their technology, their ideology, the way they work, and not least the watches that result from it. I think all of that is absolutely amazing. And it's not just about being the most expensive or the wildest. It's actually about the fact that it's quite impressive to be able to enter the horological industry in just over 20 years and rise to compete with, and in many ways even surpass, manufacturers that have been around for hundreds of years. And they are the manufacturer that today has the most expensive watch, or rather by far the highest average price per watch they sell. And when you consider Patek's relatively high prices, as well as Audemars Piguet 2, and some of the smaller manufacturers, well then that really says a lot. So we're really looking forward to introducing the Danish watch market to this in more detail. And if anything, this is about capital preservation and good investments over time. We could also see that Richard Mille was one of the brands that held up the absolute best during the correction we experienced the year before last. It really takes a major push in the market before Richard Mille prices change. And that's understandable, given how few watches there are on the market, how many wealthy people there are all over the planet, and with even more wealthy individuals on the way worldwide. So it just makes really, really good sense to get exposure there if you can afford to play at that level of capital preservation. Linnea, now we've talked a bit about how we experience watches and wonders. What the actual big news was, which maybe isn't just about the watches themselves, but also about how people view the market, the way people see us as the so-called grey market. I actually prefer the term secondary market instead, as a player in that. And I think that actually leads us a bit to, among others, Jacob & Co. We'll be talking about them after Easter. We'll also be doing a review then. One of our very first Jacob & Co. watches ever is arriving at the watch dealer, and maybe even the first one in Denmark. What do I know? And I'm really looking forward to showing that to our dear followers. We're going to go check it out. We're taking a trip to the store to talk about Richard Mille, and I'm really excited to show something different. And again, it's not just about having the most expensive watches. It's about the fact that there are other ways to look at horology. There are modern takes on what has been super ultra conservative for hundreds of years, and I just find that incredibly fascinating. I'm also looking forward to showing that to our dear followers out there.
Yes. I actually think that's all we have time for this time, Daniel. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for making time. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay tuned.